Since it is Father's Day, I did want to start with the story of a father. The father I want to tell you about is a man named Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard. He was a man who lived many years ago. He was a Dane. He was a Lutheran Christian. And one day he did something that changed and marked his life for the rest of it, that marked his family, and that ultimately changed the world. Michael Kierkegaard was a peasant farmer. He was poor. He had a rough life. And one day he just got so angry that things had not gone well for him, that he had not had the opportunities to advance that other people seemed to get. And this one day he got so angry about how life had gone for him that this is what he did. He went out and he climbed the highest mountain that he could find. And he got to the top and he stood there. And he raised a clenched fist to the heavens and he cursed God with a hatred and an anger that consumed him. And then his fury spent. Michael Kierkegaard lowered his fist, he walked down that mountain, and he went on with his life. And actually after that, he had a few lucky breaks. He became a very wealthy man, in fact, but he also suffered a number of personal tragedies in his life. And in particular, perhaps hardest for him, though he had many children, he lost almost all of them while they were still young. And in fact, only two of his children, Peter and Soren, grew to adulthood. And as Michael Kierkegaard reflected on all of this, he came to the conclusion that because that day he had cursed God, God had cursed him and his family. He became depressed. He became sullen, which only convinced him all the more that he was living under a curse. And he began to believe that everything good in his life, his wealth, his extremely intelligent, well-educated children, his many blessings were simply things that God had given to him to mock him by taking them away at the worst possible moment. And Michael Kierkegaard grew old and he died a very bitter, bitter man. Now the only reason, we only know about this story of Michael Kierkegaard for one reason. And that is because his son, Soren Kierkegaard, became perhaps the greatest theologian and philosopher of his time. And this experience of his father greatly informed Soren Kierkegaard's theology and thought about God and faith and religion. And he had a very hard struggle with God. And out of that struggle came a great deal of wisdom. But I don't want to talk about Soren Kierkegaard's theology today. I want to talk about the influence of fathers. And the father I want to talk about isn't even Michael Kierkegaard. I want to talk about another father who maybe started out sort of like Michael Kierkegaard did and could have ended up like him with a sense of curse, but didn't. Who instead ended up with a new name and with a blessing. The father I'm talking about is, of course, Jacob. And the story of Jacob begins with his name. The name Jacob sounds in Hebrew like two other Hebrew words. The word for grasp and the word for heel. And the explanation that is given in the book of Genesis for this man being called Jacob is out, grasping his brother's heel. And so he was called Heel Grasper. But this name was not just about some odd little occurrence around the man's birth. It actually went to the heart of who this man was and who he became. And for all of his young life, this Jacob really lived as a heel grasper. He spent his life grasping after many different things. He spent his young life competing with his older brother Esau, competing for a blessing and a promise that he wanted to inherit from his father. And ultimately, Jacob got together with his mother and he tricked his father Isaac into giving that blessing to him. But all of this grasping had a cost. And eventually, Jacob's brother Esau got tired of all the grasping because he was the victim of it. And he swore that the next time he saw Jacob, he was going to kill him. Jacob had to run for his life. But even that day of reckoning did not stop Jacob's grasping after many things. He just went on to grasp someplace else. He went on to grasp in the home of his uncle, Laban. He arrived on the doorstep of his uncle with nothing. And there, within a few years, he gained from his uncle great wealth. 4 wives, who gave him 12 children, and a vast wealth in flocks and herds. Of course, eventually Laban also got tired of Jacob's grasping and got angry with him, and Jacob had to leave there too. And that is where we find Jacob in our reading this morning from the book of Genesis. His angry uncle is behind him. And he has just found out that his brother Esau, who swore to kill him next time he saw him, is in front of him. Jacob's in the middle. All of his chickens have finally come home to roost. And when Jacob is there, stuck between Laban and Esau, he has an experience that changes his life. And we know that it changes his life because he limps away from that experience with a new name. And in the Bible, a new name means a new identity, a new way of seeing himself. Now what happens to Jacob is this. He struggles with a stranger who seems to be God. He wrestles, he struggles with God. Now, what exactly that looked like, what you would have seen if you had been there that night by the River Jabbok, I don't know. But I do know a thing or two about wrestling with God. For Jacob is not the first person, and certainly not the last, to struggle to wrestle with God. That's what Michael Kierkegaard was doing when he climbed that mountain and shook his fist at the heavens. He was wrestling with God. Lots of people wrestle with God. Michael Kierkegaard did it because he was disappointed at how his life had turned out and the options that had come to him. But others struggle for different reasons, perhaps even better reasons. Some struggle with God because of some personal tragedy. Someone that they care for is taken from them or struggles very badly. They get angry with God, they struggle with God. Other people struggle with God over some point in theology. Still more common, many struggle with God because God has been misrepresented to them by his followers here on earth. So they struggle. But there are many different reasons to struggle with God, and many of those are very good reasons to struggle with God. Lots of people struggle with God. I don't know exactly why Jacob struggled with God at that particular point in his life. I suspect it probably has something to do with the fact that he was just kind of tired of having to grasp after everything his whole life long. He lashed out at God like we sometimes do. But whatever the reason, at that point, he really entered into a struggle with God. But the important thing I want to take from this is that Jacob came out of that struggle. He limped away from it with a blessing. So many others, like Michael Kierkegaard, struggle with God and don't come away with a blessing. They come away with a curse. Why is that? And what can we learn from Jacob about how to struggle with God and come away with a curse? Because I don't think we can really avoid it. Struggling with God is natural to human beings. If you're going to take the existence of God seriously, if you're going to be honest with your emotions, sooner or later, you're going to get upset with God, and you're going to have words, you're going to struggle. It's what it is to be human. Now, I know there are some who would say, no, that's not right. It's not right to have negative feelings, negative emotions about God. It's not right to complain to God about God. That's evil, that's sinful, that's wrong. But I don't buy that. I don't buy that because the Bible is full of examples of people who complain and complain very loudly to God. There's a whole class of psalms, like the one we read this morning, that are called Psalms of Lament, which are basically people pouring out their complaints about God to God. It's a time-honored tradition. There's nothing ungodly about taking your honest, negative feelings about God to God. That's what Jacob does. And yet somehow in that, Jacob is able to bring out a blessing, others are not. So what is special and unique about Jacob's approach that we can adopt? Because we're not going to avoid the struggle. If we're honest with God, we will wrestle sooner or later, at some point in our lives. Well, the first thing I notice about Jacob's approach to his struggle with God is this. He's all in. He enters into what is described as a no-holds-barred wrestling match with God. He is completely vulnerable to God. So vulnerable, in fact, that he is wounded in the struggle. And that vulnerability, that openness to God, is, I think, the first lesson we need to learn from Jacob. If you're going to be struggling with God, you need to be vulnerable. Secondly, in his struggle, Jacob has a very clear goal. As he struggles with this stranger in the night, Jacob asks, he implores his opponent, "Tell me your name." And the name in the Bible, as I said, always goes to somebody's true identity. What Jacob is doing is he is striving above all to know this God that he is engaging. He doesn't just want to pour his frustrations to him. He wants to know the God that he's talking to. And that makes all the difference. I think that's where Michael Kierkegaard fell short. Yes, he climbed that mountain. Yes, he expressed his frustrations to God, but then he just stopped away angry. He didn't stay around. He didn't engage with that God that he was complaining about. And if he had done that, really striven at that moment to know the God that he was complaining about. I'm not saying that God would have answered all his questions. I'm not saying that God would have resolved all of his issues. But he would have come to know a God in that who was compassionate and loving, who understood where he was, and was willing to enter into the struggles of his life with him. There would have been blessing in that. So Jacob engages God, fully, completely, vulnerably, and questing ever to know this God that he engages. And out of that he receives a blessing. Of course, he also receives something else. He receives a new name. Henceforth, we're told he is to be called Israel. And I'll give you one guess what the name Israel means. Jacob means heel grasper. Israel means the one who struggles with God. The one who struggles with God. That's the new identity that Israel finds for himself. Which suggests to me that this wrestling match with God by the river Jabbok was not just a one-time thing for Jacob. He just didn't do it once and walk away with everything resolved. What his new name means is that he will continue for the rest of his life to engage in that struggle with God. It is an ongoing thing. Because you see, when you engage with God, it's not about the immediate answers you get. It's not about the immediate resolution of what you're struggling with, though that may come sometimes. It's the process. And as you continue that relationship, which can be difficult, which can be a struggle sometimes, you will ever enter deeper into the blessing of knowing God. Israel, of course, was the name that Jacob passed on to his children and to the nation that they eventually became. And so that nation, in a very real sense, becomes, as far as the Bible is concerned, the nation that struggles with God for a blessing. And the rest of the Bible really is the tale of that ongoing struggle with God to find a blessing. And we, my friends, we are heirs of that struggle. We, as Christians, are heirs of that struggle through and because of Jesus Christ. We also continue that struggle with God. That's what a lot of people don't get about Christianity. A lot of people think that Christianity is about having all the answers, having it all figured out. It's not. It's about the process of an ongoing struggle with God. It's about living with the questions as often as it is about finding the answers. But in that ongoing struggle, there is a blessing. There is a blessing. God will not curse you. God will not curse you just because you come to Him and express the frustration, the negative feelings, the troubles you're having, the anger you may have to God. What did you think that God, the creator of the universe, He who spread out the stars in such splendor, who created this earth in such beauty, is going to have His little itty feelings hurt? If you get a little down at Him, I think that God can handle it. God will not curse you. God wants to bless you. I don't think that God wanted to curse Michael Kierkegaard. I think He wanted to bless him. But because Michael Kierkegaard didn't stick it out, because he just expressed his frustration and stopped off angry, didn't stick it out, he convinced himself of the curse. Because he didn't know the God that he was engaging with. When when you don't know the God you're engaging with, it's so easy to believe wrong things about him, like that he wants to curse you. His son Soren Kierkegaard inherited that struggle. He continued that struggle in his theology, and ultimately he did discover God and find that blessing. Got to follow through. So do not be afraid to bring who you are, who you really are. Your full emotions, your frustrations, your fear, even your anger to God. But stick it out. And seek to know the God you're engaging and struggling with, for in that there is a great blessing for you and for your children and your children's children. This I do believe. Well, you take a few moments.